James Ernest, The Grueling Truth, here with author and Keene, author of the Cloudbuster Nine, the untold story of Ted Williams and the baseball team that helped win World War II. Thank you for coming on the show today.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
What is your personal connection with this story?
Well, of all things, my father, as a child, was the base mascot, Bat Boy. And he became a minor league player, almost made it to the pros. And he passed away a few years ago. And, you know, my father had two daughters, but baseball was always the narrative of our house. And, around the house, I mean, the man had a photographic memory for stats. And unfortunately, he was one of those players, which really is millions of people who, you know, they have this dream to become a major league player. It didn't quite work out, and he was very sad and nostalgic for the rest of his life. But he always talked about those days during World War II. After Pearl Harbor, let me set the stage for this. When my father's father, my grandfather, had gone to the Naval Academy, graduated in 1926. When Pearl Harbor was bombed, you know, a lot of these men were working elsewhere. He had, graduated, didn't go into the service. He was in the steel industry in Philadelphia. And he obviously was one of the first to want to go back into the service just to support the cause. So there was a gentleman by the name of Tom Hamilton, and he had also gone to the Naval Academy, and he was a legend in football. He was a coach, and during the war, he was a pilot. And he was charged by really the Secretary of the Navy to come up with a way to train fighter pilots. And as you know, with Pearl Harbor, the war really went from the sea to the sky. And so they had to come up with ways to, fast track, A, find potential pilots, and B, get them in physical shape. So thus was born something called, through the V-5 Naval Aviation Program, the pilot training schools. And there were only 5 of them. They were elite, they were small, they were highly, highly selective. And I'm going to tell you about some of the famous people, men who went through these schools for training. So let's fast forward to 1942. My grandfather moved his family from Philadelphia. My father was at Haverford School, pulled him out of school. They moved down to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, to the Eastern Seaboard Pre-Flight School. So my dad, as a little kid, just runs around the base. The town of Chapel Hill basically went from a sleepy college town to a full-fledged military base during the war. And they did it because they selected, various schools and organizations to house these training programs. And, every day my dad was down at the baseball field. And, again, these were basically viewed as little mini naval academies. And they trained thousands of cadets who came in and out like a grinding mill throughout the war. And they used 9-10 different sports to get pilots in perfect physical shape for that next phase of training where they actually flew. So again, this is a 90-day training course. My dad is a little boy. This is where it all starts. Became the mascot for the baseball team. And in 1943, my book really takes off, focusing on that very, very famous team where Ted Williams was there, Johnny Pesky, Buddy Hassett, John Stain. I mean, you name it. There were roughly 23, 24 major league players who cycled through Chapel Hill during World War II. A lot of Hall of Famers, Charlie Gehringer. But in 1943, my dad was the bat boy for this very famous team. When he passed away a few years ago, I went in our basement, and it is a cliche, but there was a trunk that he had saved, scrapbooks, clippings, trading cards, unbelievable memorabilia. And I opened it up, and to write his eulogy, I just sat there for hours pouring through the material. Assumed certainly there were many books about it. They had to be, of course, but there were not. So from that point, I got to work on Dad's eulogy, wrote his obituary. His name was James Plummer Rao Jr. So anybody out there listening, you can Google him. And I looked up his baseball record for the first time that night. And he was quite a pitcher, but he was injured. And everything fell apart from there. But he did have this famous story about being the bat boy for this team, and that's where it all began.
What's the significance of the name Cloudbuster?
That's a really good question. I believe, And, there is something called a cloudbuster. It's a scientific device that can produce rain, if you will. But I believe it was the image of the airplanes busting through the clouds. And there was a newspaper called the Cloudbuster. It was a weekly Navy publication put out by the base. And if you look at the masthead, lo and behold, it's of an airplane busting through the clouds. And that just was the team moniker for, every team out of that base, be it swimming, track, football. They were known, obviously for baseball as the Cloudbuster Nine.
So a lot of the great photos in the book, are they from your father's trunk, or are they from other places?
Well, most of those are really from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, the Lewis Round Library. They have thousands of items from the Navy Pre-Flight School, and they have them because of a gentleman who actually was a famous athlete in his own right, named Kid Brewer, a.k.a. Kid Brewer football stadium up at Appalachian State. He had been a legendary football player at Duke, lettered in practically a dozen sports, and he was the Navy publicist. He was too old to fly. So he came in as a Navy publicist, and he basically took pictures of everything. He had cartoon artists all over base. He got film producers to come in and record, make motion picture films of all these famous athletes. They really were symbols for kids, for the American people, just to show, here we are with these famous athletes on base. They captured everything that they did. And so my dad's trunk, Kid Brewer and the Navy publicist team gave all of the officers beautiful scrapbooks. And in those scrapbooks, I was able to find a number of the pretty famous photographs that you see like up at the Hall of Fame, featuring my dad with a bunch of kids who, were standing there at the knees of Ted Williams and Johnny Pesky. Again, these are very famous pictures. Ted's daughter, Claudia, who's just lovely. She's been a huge advocate in this book. I shared this with her, and she hadn't seen them before. So, again, many of these pictures, if you pull them up from Navy Pre-Flight Cloudbusters, they might be recognizable, but a lot of people don't know where they were taken. And they indeed were taken at Emerson Field at Chapel Hill at the University of North Carolina during World War II.
Was it difficult to get the former players to open up and discuss their stories?
Well, none of the former players are alive except one. Pesky died a few years ago, and what I've done is interviewed the children of the players. David Pesky and Allison are just lovely people. I met with them in Gloucester and sat with them for hours at the kitchen table. They opened up scrapbooks, and they had some pictures that are in my book that you're not going to see anywhere else. Again, it was really through the children of the players, but I happened to discover a gentleman who lives outside of Detroit. He lives in Marshall, Michigan, for listeners out there. His name's Ivan Flesser. He's 98 years old, and he was the original pitcher on the team. Ivan never talked about it. He's a humble man. He was a baseball coach for decades up there in Michigan. And lo and behold, I got him on the phone, spent 2 days with him up there. He told me the whole story, and there he was. He actually shipped in with Gerald Ford, who was an athletic instructor at the school. But Ivan told me all about it and really how they played baseball a little differently to train them for becoming fighter pilots.
How did they play it differently?
Well, one thing is every sport that they identified, like, for example, soccer, which is what George Bush specialized in when he was there, it was for eye, foot, coordination, and you've got to have foot coordination for, pedals on airplanes. And again, it was all about balance. And there was track and field. Football truly was the anchor sport at pre-flight, and that was for hard hitting. I discovered another living cadet who's in his 90s now, and he was a little guy. And he said that, you get on a football field with NFL players, and they are going to steamroll you. They are going to just knock the crap out of you. You know it. But that prepared you for the heavy hit. And it was all about getting hit, getting knocked out. And also, there were always 4 ambulances around the field. And bones were broken every day at these pre-flight schools. I mean, the grueling truth, you talk about extreme sports. This is what it was all about in the 40s. But they could get knocked out cold, but the whole point was get back up and play again.
So it sounds like the training was quite intense.
It was the most difficult physical training program in the world at the time introduced in the military, and I've gotten that verified by many sources, and that was the whole point. When Tom Hamilton was asked to create this program, and then the academic syllabuses attached to it, we had no choice. We had a war to win. And they were very selective about the candidates that they brought in. John Glenn was another pre-flight candidate, as well as Scott Carpenter. But they were the humble guys. But again, and I can't stress this enough, it was all about getting knocked out, but getting up and taking care of that next man to defend your country. It was all about teamwork. And again, it was taking the hit, not complaining, and just getting up day after day and continuing with the training to graduate so you could indeed fly.
And along with the sports and the training, they had a survival course?
Oh, yes. And I'm so glad you asked about that. That pretty much blew my mind. The baseball coach was a gentleman by the name of Donald Kepler, who really, anybody who knows Penn State, he was a baseball player up there and a coach. But the thing about Don Kepler is he was a game hunter. And he shot bears and deers and turkeys. I mean, they were all in his backyard up in Happy Valley around Penn State. And he, when the war broke out, he was recruited to come down there and really create the model for the survival training school. And in Chapel Hill, he worked with two men by the name of Frank and John Craighead, and they were National Geographic explorers, photographers. They were champion wrestlers at Penn State, but he brought them along, and the three of them really designed what that, quote, survival school looked like. And Don Kepler was another humble character, but he, at the time of the war, I've gotten original speeches that he gave from his children, who still reside in Ohio, up near you and around the Penn State area. And they said, in his speeches that 75% of these pilots, when they crashed down, they were alive, but they couldn't survive. They couldn't swim. A lot of the pre-flight cadets, when they came in, they couldn't swim. So they had to learn to swim. They had to learn to find food and water. And they were set out into the wilderness. I mean, you crash down in the jungle, you've got to find a way to survive. And that is what they learned at pre-flight. And through that program, a book was written, and you can Google this today. It's How to Survive on Land and Sea. That book is so good. It is grounded in such ancient knowledge passed down from Kepler, who actually learned from Civil War veterans, who learned from the Indians. It's just, how do you survive? And it is so good and popular that it is still available online today. Again, How to Survive on Land and Sea. And it's written really by the Navy, but Kepler was behind that. And one more important story. Kepler was very close to Ted Williams. He, in fact, picked him up at Durham train station, and he was a little nervous about it because, Ted was notoriously, allegedly hard to handle, but the two of them got in the car. They didn't talk about baseball. They talked about fishing and hunting, and they were friends for life. And, again, that relationship was born and forged in Chapel Hill at Navy pre-flight school.
What percentage went from the pre-flight school to flight school?
Well, what percentage? Roughly, I'm going to say 80,000 cadets went through this program. And there's really no comparison today, but that's a small percentage of guys. When you think about the people who served during World War II, roughly 60,000 graduated. About 25% were flushed out. They just couldn't make the grade, and a lot of them got shipped out in the middle of the night. But all of my baseball players, profiled in my book, they all graduated.
So who got the opportunity to watch this amazing team?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question again. Really, that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. I'll just be candid with you. It was for the kids and for the people. The pilots, they left huge contracts behind, and that's to go without saying. And Ted Williams is truly, Johnny Pesky, they are the ultimate patriots. They put their careers aside. They served their country. When they went down to pre-flight training, they didn't really know how much baseball they would play. It was really a varsity sport for the campus, and they practiced a couple hours a day. But on top of drilling and training 16 hours a day and studying, which wasn't easy, they boarded these clunky, horrible old tin buses, and I'm talking bad buses, no air conditioning, and went to town in North Carolina for the duration of the summer, and they would play factory teams like Cameo Mills, Burlington Mills. They played the Durham Bulls a couple times. They went up to Norfolk. They played those two Navy teams, which were truly two of the finest teams, as we know, in the Navy or in the service during World War II. But they crisscrossed North Carolina. They went down to Fort Bragg. They played, I believe, at Camp Lejeune. So they basically played a lot of factory teams, minor league teams. They played colleges like NC State and Duke. And they didn't get a dime for this. Not only were they beaten to a pulp, as you say, extreme sports, I mean, they were bruised and, they had fractures, stitches. Their toenails were, black and blue. They had huge calluses on their hands from climbing cargo ropes, out of the pool, just to learn how to escape ships and so forth. They were learning to swim, and they were completely exhausted. But somehow they found that energy to jump on those buses and play in those war bond games, again, from rowdy little scrubby fields. They played at Hillcrest Field in Burlington, and that's just a Mount Rushmore-sized memory of people who were in their 80s and 90s today. They were little kids, and here they got to see this all major league team pull into town, on this old bus. And then I guess the highlight was when they played up at Yankee Stadium against the team managed by Babe Ruth, and that's historic in its own right.
How successful was that game in raising money for the war bonds?
Minimally, frankly. They raised like maybe $30,000 or something like that. I mean, it wasn't a huge figure. They brought Babe Ruth in, though, as a manager because, war bond games, they could be tremendous successes, but they really were about boosting morale, if you really want to know the truth at the end of the day. And there's something very important in my book. Again, it's called the Cloudbuster Nine. And it's about how they were very careful about letting these athletes off base because, some parents got the impression of, well, why is my son out there in the Pacific when these star players are running around in buses having the time of their lives playing baseball? And so oftentimes players like Ted Williams, he was held on base and he didn't get to go. He did get to go to these larger, more high-profile games, but, for a while there it was unsure. They'd say in the headlines, sorry, he's not going to go because they had a rule. They could only leave base for 48 hours at a time. So, again, it was really all about training. So there was no guarantee that all these players would be released to play for some of the bigger games.
So tell us about Dr. Bobby Brown and Eddie Robinson and how they contributed to the process.
I'm so glad you asked that as well. When I first began this process, I immediately looked to see who was still alive. Because I wanted that account. I wanted to record what they had to say. I knew Bobby played on a Navy team, and it turns out, in fact, he actually played against the Cloudbusters. I believe he was at Stanford, and they played against the St. Mary's, not the Cloudbusters. They played a pre-flight team up at St. Mary's in California. And, because, again, those Navy teams played colleges. And but I, very early on, about 2 years ago, through a friend of mine, Jim Bayless, he said, I know Dr. Brown very well. I think he might sit down with you. And we drove up to Fort Worth. He's a lovely man. I mean, they say there's that saying, 1 in a million. He's 1 in 100 million. I mean, he's an incredible person. Very, very humble. But we sat down for hours. He told me his life story, and that's in the book about growing up in Seattle, serving in the Navy, and then how he basically, I believe he served in 2 wars, World War II and Korea, but then he becomes this position on top of it. But he knew these players who wore the Cloudbuster jersey very well. He knew Ted up until, the day he died. They were very good friends. And he was able to share just some wonderful, heartfelt stories with me, and in his living room, and just a lovely person. I'm still in touch. Got a letter from him actually yesterday. He was pleased with the book, and he'd love to hear, about what the players' families are saying. I mean, we're all so excited about it because I was able to capture this beautiful history of this team. And then I love Eddie Robinson. We talked for hours, and he's just the kindest man. And he grew up in Paris, Texas, picked cotton as a kid, worked before school, and he just worked his way up, and he's just one of the finest people I've ever had a chance to talk to. And again, he actually did play against the Cloudbusters. He was up on the Navy team in Norfolk, and he told me about being on that bus. And he remembered the players when they came up there to Norfolk, and they were old friends. And again, it's kind of along the lines of that old book, The Teammates. They were all there, and he brought me inside, told me about the team, just said, this is what it was like to play during the war, but we did it gladly. Again, they served; they were happy to do it.
So, tell us about your events that are coming up in Chapel Hill.
Well, one thing I'm doing is I'm actually speaking to a few different senior living communities where they are living to death. And that's truly been a joy because they were there. And it was just part of the discovery process. I did most of my research down at the library in Chapel Hill and got a lot of help with their staff there. I talked about 2 weeks ago to the Chapel Hill Historical Society and had the privilege of being on a radio show with D.G. Martin. And you guys, if you want to hear a wonderful podcast, it's D.G. Martin who's talking. It's the Hill Radio down in Chapel Hill. They call it Chapel Borough. But pull that podcast up from the 24th, I believe, April 24th. We sat down for 45 minutes and had a conversation very similar to this. DG he's an institution in Chapel Hill. He knew a little bit more about the team, and so we just got into great detail about when they came into Chapel Hill, what that was like. So again, pull that podcast up. But again, I'm talking tomorrow, actually, and the next day down in Chapel Hill to some senior living communities. And then I'm going to weave back and forth to bookstores. I'll be at Flyleaf in July, back in Chapel Hill. Here in Austin, I'm going to be speaking at Book People on May 25th, and I'm so proud to say that my book was chosen as the Statesman Select Book of the Month with Book People. Love Book People. Big shout out for that indie bookstore here. So Cloudbusters is the book of the month there, and I'm doing a Veterans Day presentation Friday night, May 25th at 7. And then from there, I'll be speaking at Sabre for that conference. These are some of the big ones in June up in Pittsburgh, and then I'll be weaving around Washington, D.C., making some talks there. But again, my time this summer is going to be pretty much in the middle of the road between Texas, North Carolina, D.C. Hopefully, I'll be going up to Boston, and so you'll be able to catch me in different venues, bookstores, and I'll be at just different bookstores. And my book also now is available at Target, Barnes & Noble, Walmart, of course Amazon, and a lot of the indie bookstores, which I just love, like Book People around the country.
I was going to say, this book's amazing. Just the detail, just how exciting it is about the history of baseball and the military. Any chance there's going to be a follow-up, maybe called The Hero Factory, where you go into some of the other people, like you mentioned, George Bush with the soccer, or Gerald Ford? Could you tell us some of those people that were part of the Hero Factory?
Oh, yeah, and I love that thing, and I'm glad you appreciate it. Well, George Bush, I mean, there has been so much written about him and his life, and I never thought I could find anything original. I mean, he's a legend. I think he's a wonderful man. Politics aside, he really was there. He enlisted on his 18th birthday, and he was in the 6th Battalion in Chapel Hill, which means he was in one of the first classes. So he was there in 1942, and he trained just like everybody else. And I actually found in a story that I hadn't seen before in the Cloudbuster Navy newspaper, where they talk about him playing soccer against Duke. And he was quite the soccer player, and the reason he didn't play on that varsity baseball team in Chapel Hill is because he wasn't there during that season. He came in August of '42 and left at the end of October. But again, there's this story, and I really want people to read the book, so I hate to give it all away. But I will tell you that one of the sons of the survival school instructor and the baseball coach ran into Bush many decades later, and Bush, he was so kind to him. He goes, "Hey, you're probably not going to remember my dad, but his name was so-and-so, Donald Kepler." And he said Bush just turned around in his tracks. He goes, "Well, of course I remember him." And they spent hours going through some Navy scrapbooks. He invited him into his marina. They were up in Maine when this happened, up at Kennebuck. But he just said Bush was just lovely. It was like he was just every guy's guy. And really that was one of the themes that I discovered in the book was these guys, they may have been an astronaut, they may have been the President of the United States, but at the end of the day, they were cadets. And they were old friends, and I've been able to track down a lot of these people, a lot of original letters written from, men like Gerald Ford to, former cadets and officers when they passed away. And again, it was just really a deep friendship, and it was like that book, The Teammates. It's just that friendship and that kinship, but really that respect was there. And again, Bear Bryant was another coach, but at the end of the day, they were just friends, and they had each other's backs, if you will. And, you're going to read some of those stories in this book, which have not been told.
If fans are wanting to find out more about the book or find out about those events, do you have a social media page or website?
I do. My personal website for the book is www.annerkeene.com, and it's www.annerkeene.com, and then you can find it up, on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. You can read a little bit more about it there. But yeah, again, I've got a website. It'll show my events. It will show, the articles that have come out. The podcast is on there from D.G. Martin, and I'll be putting your podcast on there in about 20 minutes. One other shout out I want to make is I've had the honor to serve and to help some nonprofits supporting baseball, and one of which is the Act of Valor organization in honor of Bob Feller, and it's a foundation that is a unique intersection of baseball and the military, especially the Navy. It recognizes and honors people and those men and women who support our service, men and women. And there's something called the Bob Feller Act of Valor Award, but there's an essay contest. And it's really for kids in the military, and it's in honor of the major league players. And, it encourages kids to talk about the pillars of education, the character, the service, the sacrifice, the legacy of these players. So, again, if people want to check that out, it's www.actofvaloraward.org, and it will tell you about that Hall of Fame essay contest. And, kids in I believe it's Maryland, North Carolina, Virginia, the D.C. area, a few areas, states surrounding the Washington area. But if they want to enter that contest, we're seeking those applications for that essay award. And they will be invited to an event in Washington in the fall to celebrate.
Sounds great, Ann. Thank you for joining us today on the Grueling Truth Radio Network. Enjoyed hearing about your book, the Cloudbuster Nine, the untold story of Ted Williams and the baseball team that helped win World War II. And it is the perfect book for the summer. You're relaxing by the pool or you're listening to that baseball game on the radio, and it just brings you back to such rich history.
Well, thank you, and it's been a real pleasure to be on the show, and I appreciate what you do. I feel like you do a great job of bringing out the story behind the story, and it's fun for an author like me to be able to say, great, I've written this book, but this is truly what it's about. But thank you so much for all that you do to bring these stories out.
My pleasure. You have a great day, Ann.
You too. Thanks.